An important feature of many large businesses, which appears and disappears throughout human history, is the ability for an investor to resell partial interest in the venture to another investor. This is particularly important feature for investors who are participating in firms that have long-lived assets, many of which are often illiquid. This notion of asset lock-in, where a firm might purchase particular assets that are long-lived but very difficult to cash out, tended to go hand in hand with the notion of tradable shares or liquidity, which might allow an investor to exit their position without necessarily having to disrupt the firm's operation. This type of transferability helps investors to avoid consumption disruptions, which is particularly important to investors who don't necessarily have the freedom to lock up their capital for 5, 10, 20 years at a time, waiting simply until their yield recovers it. Some investors have got large pools of money available to them, or reasonably large pools of money available to them for spans of time like 6 months or a year or 2 years. And if they were only able to invest in assets or partnerships or organizations with lifespans of 6 months, a year, or 2 years, this would necessarily limit their capacity to engage in longer term projects, which might actually end up creating more value for them. Now, the first instance that we see of publicly tradable shares occurs in the Roman Republic period with what are called the Societates Publicanorum. These were organizations of investors during the Roman Republic period who leased rights from the state to perform functions like tax collection, the building and maintenance of large buildings, the management of public properties like fishing rights, mining territories, forestry management. These were effectively a privatization of state functions into the hands of citizens themselves. Now, in these types of situations, we found that a large number of investors could only really be attracted if the shares themselves could be traded, because the rights to a particular function might take years to recover the initial cost of, which of course would have limited ownership only to those people who could afford to have their money tied up for years at a time. So when we consider the example of the Societates Publicanorum, perhaps its most interesting feature is its transferable ownership. Mamandir in 2009, you can read his paper at the link below, actually suggests that trading of shares in these organizations was rather widespread, noting that Polybius identifies a large number of citizens participating in the Societates Publicanorum, with shares being traded at the Temple of Castor and Pollux in Rome. What we see here at the top is all that remains, unfortunately, of what perhaps may have been the world's first stock market. Now, the Societates Publicanorum had a governance system in place to ensure that the liability of the firm or the organization had a place to call to when there were problems, like buildings which collapsed, for instance. In general, the control of the organization and, of course, personal liability for the organization's failure laid with a lead partner who is called the manseps. The manseps was allowed to contract on behalf of the group, much like a Nazir did for his investors 16 centuries before. But the manseps was personally liable for any of the Societates' liabilities, meaning that this person generally had to be very well respected, very creditworthy, and of course, have very deep pockets. Now, like a modern corporation, the Societates could actually sue other groups, for instance, or individuals, usually for fraud, and they were able to collectively own property. Now, this is not the only instance that we see in the pre-modern world of publicly traded shares. While many people will try to claim that the first corporations were the British or Dutch East India companies, we in fact have evidence that these are predated by centuries by another organization from Western Europe, L'Honneur del Bazacle, which was a French milling company that got started in 1138 when 4 partners decided to pool their capital to acquire rights to build mills at the site of a particular formation in the Garonne River called the Bazacle. At that particular place, there is a bend in the river, and the river becomes a little bit more shallow, causing the waters of the river to run faster, meaning, of course, that there is more opportunity to harvest its kinetic energy with a mill and perform various milling operations. Now, of course, because this was based off of a natural formation, people continued to exploit this natural resource for centuries. By 1327, there were at least a dozen different firms operating independently at the site. And of them, 12 decided to merge their operations together in order to improve coordination, enhance their bargaining power, and spread risk. Prior to this, there had been problems of individuals trying to fight or jockey for the best positions on the river that allowed them to generate the most power from the rapidly rushing waters. And in some cases, mills which had been floating in the river had their chains break and damage other mills. So the effort to work together and coordinate was not just a matter of spreading costs, but also a matter of protecting individual interests from potential fallout of a poorly managed operation by someone working in the same area. Now, shares in Honor del Bazacle were transferable, and over the centuries, what's particularly interesting is that we have records that show who held these shares. Sometimes it was a matter of investors or entrepreneurs who owned these shares, but they were also held by the operators of the mills themselves, their heirs, local lawyers, members of city governments, bankers, even religious institutions, and the millers themselves ended up holding some of these shares and thereby profiting from the productivity of these assets. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, this type of large, long-lived institution required a sophisticated governance system. And in fact, Leonor's governance system was a significant improvement over that of the Societatis Publicanorum. In this case, Leonor actually had a charter that laid out all of the responsibilities of various parties who had the authority to allocate resources within the firm. There was an oversight committee put in place to ensure that investments were being made in ways that would benefit all of the owners. There were annual shareholder meetings where people could voice their discontent with decisions that were being made with their resources. And of course, there were provisions to both report and distribute profits to the owners. It's worth noting that this early corporation survived for over 800 years. And it was finally nationalized when it was finally nationalized by the French government in 1945 following World War II. On the site of the Bazacle today, we still see people making use of turbine technology as the mills have been replaced with a hydroelectric dam. Nonetheless, the story of L'Honneur del Bazacle points to the fact that this type of coordination system does not necessarily require a top-down authority from the state, but instead can rise up from the bottom as entrepreneurs seek to enhance the efficiency of their coordination systems.